Hello, in this presentation we will compare QuickBooks Online versus QuickBooks Desktop. Hello, in this presentation we're going to talk about lists within QuickBooks Online. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are in the QuickBooks Online dashboard. We will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. We're going to be talking about lists. When talking about lists for QuickBooks, it's kind of a specialized term. Accounting, of course, has a lot of terminology within it, and QuickBooks actually has some slightly different terminology within the software. When people talk about lists within QuickBooks, they're often talking about a chart of accounts or item lists, and we'll take a look at those two components. Might not be so common to think of them in that format within the online version as the desktop version, because the desktop version had a drop-down called lists, and everything under there would be what QuickBooks defines as their major accounting lists. But as we move to the online version, we still see the terminology of lists, and it's probably going to move over from people that have used the desktop version a lot as they move to more use in the online version. So the lists are going to be the major list of items that we are going to be using, then the chart of accounts and the item lists. So to find those in the online version, we can go down to the accounting section down here, and we'll select that item. And then we have the chart of accounts up top, and then we can go back to the all lists and see more lists here. The chart of accounts is going to be the major list that we would think of. It's going to be, of course, the list of accounts that we will have. And the chart of accounts is typically going to be in order by the account type rather than by name, although we could change the ordering of these items. But typically the default will be by account type, which makes sense because as we look at a trial balance, it will be in order by account type, meaning rather than being in alphabetical order or even order by account number, which is an option that we don't currently have here, and I don't recommend using account numbers unless you understand how the account numbers work. Otherwise the numbers will get messy. So if you do understand the account numbers, then you can put those in there and make sure that they line up in essence with the ordering of the account types over here. So the detail types, typically it's going to be in order, it will be in order of assets and then liabilities, then equity, then income and expenses. Within those normal accounts, we have the asset of the checking account, the cash account, the bank account. We've got the account type of accounts receivable. Then we've got the other current assets. So here are going to be the other current assets. And then they have more specific here with account type and then the account type detail. So this is the bank and the checking account. This is the accounts receivable, which is just accounts receivable. Other accounts, we could have more specific type of other accounts here that don't fall into either checking or receivable basically, or just other current assets being the default in the other accounts section. And then we have the fixed assets, and that's going to be furniture and fixture, accumulated depreciation. Those are going to be the more long-term assets. Then we got the liabilities, starting with the accounts payable, and that's specialized in accounts payable. Then we've got the credit card accounts. We've got the who we pay our sales tax to, but that's going to be a type of other current liability. In this case, sales tax payable. Other current liabilities, which the generic thing would be other current liabilities within that category. Then we've got other current liabilities, loan payable, and other current liabilities, sales tax payable for other locations. We'll talk about sales tax at a later point. Then we have payroll tax payable as a liability. Unearned revenue, other current liabilities. Long-term liabilities then are going to be after that in the ordering of the chart of accounts. These are things due after a year. Then the equity section, so then we're going to have everything within the equity. Remember the overall order, assets, then liabilities, now equity. And then we're going to have revenue or income type of accounts. So here's our income type of accounts, which are more specialized over here in the type of income. And then we're going to scroll down and we have the expenses, starting with the cost of goods sold, and then all other expenses after that. So note that if we have a lot of in a category such as expenses, then it will be in order first by assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expense, then possibly by the alphabetical. So now within the expense categories, for example, we have the advertising asset, the A's and then the B's and then the C's within the expense category. But the advertising, of course, is not at the top of the list because we're first in order here by the type of account. This will be one of our driving lists. This will be one of the lists that we will be using when we create every form, every document, because we'll in some way need to be recording to one of these accounts, or two of these accounts will be affected with just about every form that we use, because just about every form we use will have a financial transaction. Every financial transaction has at least two accounts that will be impacted in some way. Now the other lists we could find over here, we could go to all lists on this side and look at the other lists. The major lists are going to be the chart of accounts and the products and services. We could go to the products and services here, or I think the more standard way, when you think about the products and services, that's what we sell. That's the inventory, and that's going to be the type of service items on the inventory that we sell. And I would think that most people probably go to the sales item to find that particular list. So we'll go to sales over here. And then if you go up top, you see the items up top. We're going to go to products and services. So you'll note that although the terminology of list is still down here, this particular list is probably gotten to without going through an item named list, although we still can go to all lists over here. So the name of the differentiation, the specialty of what the term list means in terms of QuickBooks may not be as defined as it would be with the QuickBooks desktop version. Desktop version having that drop down that's just named list, and it's probably the first place people go to when they go to the product list or the chart of accounts. Now if we scroll through here, this is a little bit unknown, more unknown to people that are just starting. Most people just starting to say, hey, the chart of accounts, that makes sense. We need a chart of accounts. The item lists are going to be things that we're going to use in order to generate the invoices. If you've gone through types of accounting, on theory type of accounting, and you record a transaction that we sell inventory, we probably just go through the transaction. We say, well, inventory went up and inventory went down, and the sales went up and down and whatnot. The thing that's going to drive that within QuickBooks is that we first set up those sales items. We set up, for example, the guitar lesson, a service item. So when we have an invoice, we picked this service item, and then the service item will generate the bill in terms of the sales price. So there's the sales price. It will be generated by the service item. If we set these service items up before we generate the invoice, then anybody can then generate the invoice and just pick the selected service item, and the invoice will be populated. So these are really, really important to help the data input process and important to get set up correctly. So then we have the inventory item. So in our case, we're going to sell guitars. So that's going to be even more complex in that we have a sales price when we generate an invoice or sales receipt, and we have the cost of goods sold or reduction in the inventory. That's a pretty complex journal entry when we make a sales receipt or an invoice. Setting up these service items, these products and services first is really the challenging part in order to make the data input process as easy as possible. And in order to set up this correctly, we really need to understand what the impact is, what the journal entry is, and what that then is affecting on the financial statements, the balance sheet and the income statement. So those are going to be the major lists that we have. If we go back to the all lists, you can look at the other things that QuickBooks will put in terms of lists, but just note that if you hear a term of lists, you're probably not talking to someone that is just talking in terms of financial accounting, taking financial accounting courses in a theory class, probably talking to someone working with accounting software, most likely QuickBooks, that has this more specialized defined term of lists. And when we hear lists, we're typically thinking chart of accounts as a major list, or the products and services as two major components of lists. Hello, in this presentation we're going to take a look at lists within QuickBooks Pro 2018. If you've been continuing along with us, we will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. If you have access to the backup, you can restore the backup by going to the File tab and restoring the backup. We're going to open the Open Windows or the View Windows tab by going to View up at the top an open window list first item. Therefore, and once we do that, we can see the open windows. I'm going to close everything but the Home tab, closing any other open windows we have open, only having now the Home tab open. And to get to the Home tab, we can go to the Company File and Home Page. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at lists. And lists is kind of a technical term within QuickBooks, meaning more than just a list of items, in that it's going to group lists into the drop down here. So we're going to be looking at these, and these are going to be really important items in that they're often the items that are driving a lot of the functions that we see here on the home page, meaning the lists are where we do the setup process so that when we select these items for the day-to-day data input, it's a lot easier. These day-to-day data input items will be run and driven through the making of the lists. So these lists are often things that we have to do in the setup process and get them correct. And once those are set up correctly, that being often the most difficult part, the actual processing of these systems, of these cycles, the vendor cycle, the payable cycle, the customer cycle, the sales cycle, the employee cycle, will all be much easier to do. What do we have under the lists? Main list will be the chart of accounts, followed by the item list. We've got the fixed asset item list. We're not going to spend time on with this. The price level list, not spending time on with this. Sales tax code list, we'll touch on that. That's going to give us the sales tax. If there is a sales tax within the location that we are at, we'll have to set that up within the list. We have the payroll item list. Those are going to be the main lists we want to take a look at here, starting with the chart of accounts. Now, clearly the chart of accounts is going to be something that we will have to set up. These are the actual account names, and they're going to always be set up in terms of ordering in assets, liabilities, equity, income, and then expense. More specifically, within the assets, we have the bank accounts, followed by the receivables, the accounts receivable, followed by the other current assets, then the fixed assets, then the other assets. Then we go to the liabilities, starting with the liability of accounts payable liability account types. Notice these are not accounts, these are account types. The actual accounts are over on this side. Then we have other liabilities, credit card account types, other current liabilities, long-term liabilities, equity and income type accounts. The names are going to be over here. So note that it's not in alphabetical order. It's in order by account type. And then within each account type, we are in order by alphabetical order. If you don't understand what these account types are, that's okay. We're going to walk through how to set those up. And QuickBooks allows us a process when we set up the QuickBooks file, depending on the type of company we have, to set up the chart of accounts for us and at least give us a starting point with which to work. But we really need to have some understanding of what these account types are in order for us to put together the system to make the day-to-day data input much easier. If this system isn't set up correctly first, then the day-to-day data input is much more difficult. Also note that we could use account numbers over here as well. That gives us a little bit more control within each account type in the ordering. It can also be a bit more complicated too, so if you don't understand these account types, you may want to stay away from account numbers, because it's very likely that we will number the accounts incorrectly or in a way that doesn't make sense. Let's take a look at another list. We're going to select the drop down and take a look at the item list. Item lists are often overlooked. They're a huge component in the day-to-day process and getting everything working within QuickBooks, often overlooked in terms of how QuickBooks works, because we don't really see the items as we do the chart of accounts. We all know that there's going to be a chart of accounts when we create the financial statements. Those are accounts on them. The items, though, are the things that are driving normally when we make things like invoices and sales receipts. So they're going to include our sales items, including our service items if we make service sales, and our inventory items. So whenever we make an invoice, we have to have this item, and if we have the item set up before we make the invoice, making the invoice is very easy. All we have to do is set up the invoice. We don't need to know anything. We can hire someone to make the invoice. Not a problem. If we don't have the items set up, invoicing, not so easy. We got to do a little bit more understanding. even with the item set up, we're going to have to really see what it's doing in order to understand the financial statements. And in order to set the items up, we're going to have some understanding. We need to have some understanding of what the financial statements will result in when we do something like create an invoice, create a sales receipt. So don't worry about that. We're going to get into that later. This is one of the really key components to understanding how QuickBooks works is setting up these items. We're going to go back up to the lists up top, going back to the lists. We're going to skip down to the sales tax code items, And within the sales tax code, this is a breakdown specifically of items related to sales tax, like a value added tax, and that will change depending on location, depending on state or country we are in. We'll have to set those up and be able to apply them or not apply them, meaning when we make an invoice, sometimes, for example, merchandise might be applicable to sales tax, where we will have to apply sales tax to it, and then the other items, such as service items, may not be applicable to sales tax, and therefore we would have none for the service items. So we'll need those for invoices and sales receipts as well. Going back to the drop-down, scrolling back down to the payroll item list. Another crucial list if we are running payroll. And the payroll item list will make the payroll process much easier and possible. Without the payroll item list, then the payroll process not doable or very much more difficult. So we need to set up the items. If the items are set up properly, then the payroll is pretty easy to process through. But you'll note within the payroll process, we have a lot of these items, including we've got whether we're going to pay salary, hourly. We also have the withholding information in terms of Medicare, Social Security, federal income tax. And we'll also have, if we're in different states or different countries, different state taxes. And those ones often vary from state to state. And we have to be very careful to make sure that we are putting in the proper tax, because it could vary. The federal taxes, such as Medicare, Social Security, those two are national taxes in the U.S., and therefore QuickBooks can pretty much put those together, and we're pretty sure on those. But state to state taxes, we could have some of the items that we want to make sure that we're checking what our specific rates are in our state and for our particular company, depending on the type of taxes that we are putting together. We might have some other items that are being used within the payroll process too, to help us process the payroll and take out what other necessary withholdings are needed throughout the payroll process. Very, very important part. Again, one of those parts that we have to really kind of understand a bit in order to set them up. Once set up, then we can allow someone to run the payroll process who doesn't fully understand the process too much, right? They don't need to really know how to understand what is happening to the financial statements or how the withholdings are happening to process payroll. But in order to set up payroll, in order to really understand how the financial statements are being generated, then we need to have a better understanding of that. And we will go through this when we set up the payroll process. We'll take a look at some of these items, how these items work, how to calculate some of this stuff. Other lists we have, if we go down to the list, we have some other list names, and we also have a list of vendors and profile lists. So we've got the sales rep list, we've got the customer type list, the vendor type list, the job type list, the terms list, the customer message list. So you can take a look at some of these other lists as well. But the principal lists we will be working with when setting up these accounts and setting up QuickBooks in general will be the chart of accounts, the item list, and the payroll item list in particular. Those are driving lists. Those are really important items. Those are necessary things to know to set up the QuickBooks account. Those are things that we'll go over. Those are things that we'll get a better understanding of. Once set up, those are things that really allow a user who doesn't understand those things very well to then do the day-to-day process, which we can see just through, if we go back to the home page, the flow charts. That allows us, these lists being put together properly, allows us to go through these flow charts and basically do the day-to-day tasks, whether we are working in the vendors payable section, the customer receivable or sales section, or the payroll section of the home page entering data.